The morning sun cut through the tall windows of the cafe, turning the air into a haze of gold. Dust motes drifted in the light, caught in the slow, rhythmic pulse of the room. The scent of dark, bitter coffee hung heavy, braided with the buttery sweetness of fresh pastry. I sat at a small, round table tucked into the back corner, a cup of Earl Grey warming my palms. Outside, the city was just beginning to find its stride, a low hum of tires on cobblestone and the distant, muffled chime of a church bell. A young couple sat 3 tables away, shoulders touching, their laughter rising and falling like a tide. Near the counter, a man gripped his newspaper, his brow furrowed as he muttered at a headline, his finger tapping the page in a steady, impatient beat. It was a scene of perfect, unremarkable order. The clink of porcelain against saucers, the soft murmur of private conversations, the scrape of a chair against the floor, everything moved in a predictable, comforting loop. I watched the steam rise from my tea, letting the quiet routine of the morning settle over me. My focus drifted past the laughing couple and the impatient reader, settling on a table 3 rows away. The man sitting there was the definition of average. He had a receding hairline, a frame that neither stood out nor shrank away, and he wore a suit that had lost its crispness hours ago. He held a French newspaper with both hands, his eyes scanning the columns with a practiced, dull rhythm. Every few seconds, he lifted a small espresso cup to his lips, took a measured sip, and set it back down with a soft click against the saucer. To any other patron in this room, he was just another face in the morning rush, a ghost in the machine of the city. But my eyes saw past the rumpled fabric and the mundane routine. To me, he was a target. A $25 million bounty rested on his head, a price tag for the chaos he had unleashed across global financial markets. He sat there in the golden morning light, completely unaware of the shadow looming over his table. He had no inkling that his carefully constructed world was about to unravel. The cafe remained peaceful, but the air around his table felt brittle, charged with a silence that only I could hear. The silence was broken by a sharp, rhythmic pulse against my thigh. My phone, tucked deep in my pocket, vibrated with a persistence that cut through the ambient noise of the cafe. I did not move. I waited for the vibration to cease, then shifted my weight to reach for it, keeping my movements fluid and natural. The screen lit up in the dim light of the table. 2 words. Green light. The message sat there, a cold, clinical command that stripped away the morning's facade. A sudden chill traced the line of my spine, a stark, biting contrast to the lingering warmth of the Earl Grey in my hand. I looked at the man 3 tables away. He was still reading, still sipping his espresso, still entirely oblivious. My mind began the countdown. 90 seconds. In a minute and a half, the air in this room would be replaced by fire. The windows, the tables, the laughing couple, the man with the newspaper, all of it would be reduced to rubble. The reality of the strike settled over me, heavy and absolute. I was the only person in this room who knew the end was coming. I was the only one who could have stood up, shouted a warning, or cleared the floor, but I did not move. I sat still, watching the steam rise from my cup, knowing that my job was not to save, but to ensure the silence remained unbroken. I rose from my seat with the measured grace of a man with nowhere to be. My movements were fluid, practiced, and entirely unhurried. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a few coins, and placed them on the table near the half-empty cup of tea. It was a final, meaningless gesture of civility, a small weight left behind to anchor the scene in normalcy. I did not look back at the man with the newspaper. I did not glance at the couple laughing in the corner. My gaze remained fixed on the exit, my expression a carefully crafted mask of indifference. I walked past the counter, my pace steady, neither fast enough to draw attention nor slow enough to suggest hesitation. The bell above the door chimed as I pushed it open. Outside, the city was a blur of movement and sound. I stepped into the morning rush, my shoulders relaxed, my stride matching the rhythm of the commuters. I was just another face in a city of millions, a ghost moving through the concrete veins of the metropolis. Behind me, the cafe remained. The city's symphony of car horns and distant sirens provided a perverse soundtrack to the impending chaos. Then, the world fractured. A deafening explosion ripped through the air, a physical force that rattled the pavement beneath my feet. The sound was not just an impact, it was a tearing of the atmosphere itself. I did not flinch. I did not turn my head. Behind me, the sickening crunch of collapsing masonry signaled the end of the cafe. A cascading wave of glass shattered, showering the street with glittering shards that caught the morning light. Car alarms shrieked in a sudden, jagged cacophony of electronic anguish. The air turned thick, with the taste of pulverized concrete and scorched earth. People around me stopped, their faces contorting in horror as they turned toward the smoke, their instincts drawing them to the disaster. They ran, they shouted, they froze in disbelief. I kept walking. My gaze remained fixed straight ahead, my expression entirely neutral. My pace did not quicken, nor did it falter. I wove through the growing crowd of panicked commuters, a steady, rhythmic presence in the center of the unfolding catastrophe. To anyone watching, I was just another man caught in the confusion. But my path was deliberate, my destination already secured. The screams faded into the background. Tomorrow, the news would report a tragic gas explosion, a freak accident born of faulty pipes and poor maintenance. The public would mourn, the city would rebuild, and the narrative would be set in stone. Intelligence agencies around the world would know the truth, of course. They would analyze the blast radius, the thermal signature, and the precise, surgical nature of the strike. They would see the hand of a phantom, a signature of a force they could not name. But they would never know about me. My name, my face, my existence, none of it would ever surface in their classified reports. I was the variable they could not solve, the ghost in their machine. Officially, I did not exist. I had no service record, no tax filings, no digital footprint in any government database. I was a blank space on a map, a silence in a room full of noise. This was the core of my reality, to be the architect of world-altering events while remaining entirely invisible. I kept walking, blending into the morning, a man without a past, a man without a name, a man who was already gone. Nobody applied for this job. There was no website, no recruiter, no job posting on any obscure corner of the internet. They found you, always. It was a process that began long before the first contact. Usually after you had already survived things most people would refuse to believe. You were the product of the crucible of Delta Force, the relentless, bone-deep exhaustion of SEAL Team 6, or the shadowy, unrecorded operations of CIA paramilitary units. You were already the top 1% of the 1%, a hardened veteran who thought they had seen every possible horror, endured every conceivable challenge. You had pushed your body past the point of failure, run until your lungs burned, and navigated landscapes that never appeared on the nightly news. You were a tool forged in the most unforgiving environments on the planet. The dusty, lethal alleys of Yemen, the scorched earth of Syria, the silent, freezing nights. You thought you were the hunter, the apex of your field, the one who controlled the mission. But you were merely being groomed. You were being tested, observed, and measured. They were looking for a specific type of resilience that could survive the total erasure of identity. They were waiting for the moment you realized everything was just a prelude to the void. I stood in the center of that quiet, empty space, waiting for the next phase of the void to claim me. I had survived the training, the exhaustion, and the relentless pressure of elite operations, yet I felt a strange, hollow anticipation. Then, the silence broke. A man walked toward me. He did not carry the posture of a soldier, nor the intensity of an operative. He moved with a deliberate, measured gait, his hands resting naturally at his sides. He stopped a few feet away, his face a canvas of complete, calculated neutrality. He was the kind of person you would pass on a crowded street and immediately forget. He did not offer a greeting. he did not introduce himself by name or rank. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on mine with a calm, unnerving focus that cut through the surrounding noise. He looked like a man who spent his days balancing ledgers or filing reports in a windowless office. This was the point. He was a master of the invisible. He asked one question: "How is your Arabic?" The weight of the world shifted in that single quiet moment. I knew then that the life I had known was over. I answered him, my voice steady, detailing the years spent in the unforgiving landscapes of Syria and the dusty, forgotten alleys of Yemen. My response was a summary of a life lived in the shadows, a history of operations that never appeared on any official record. He listened without changing his expression, then reached into a bag at his side. He pulled out a thin, unmarked folder. He slid it across the table. It stopped inches from my hands. I opened it. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. No logos, no classification stamps, no headers, just text. It described a unit, a phantom entity with no name, no patch, and no official existence. The military denied its presence. The intelligence agencies pretended it was fiction. Congress assumed it belonged to someone else. As I read the words, the reality of the offer settled into my bones. This was not a transfer or a promotion. This was an invitation to become something else entirely. It was an invitation to vanish. The silence in the room deepened, heavy with the weight of the choice. I looked up, the paper still in my hand, and saw the recruiter waiting for my move. The folder held the blueprint for my own disappearance. The recruiter spoke, his voice devoid of inflection, outlining the mechanics of the transition. My official military record would be meticulously altered. It would state that I had retired or transferred to a mundane training base in Kansas, a place so unremarkable that no one would ever bother to check. My family would be told I had taken a desk job, a safe and predictable existence that required long hours and frequent travel. They would believe the lie, and in doing so, they would lose the man they knew. I would miss birthdays, the solemnity of funerals, and the quiet joy of anniversaries. I would become a phantom in my own life, existing only in the margins of their memories. If I died overseas, there would be no coffin, no folded flag, and no gun salute. Just a single, anonymous star carved into a wall, a silent testament to a life lived in the shadows with no name beneath it. The recruiter watched me, his gaze unwavering, as the full weight of the sacrifice settled into the room. He knew that the hardest part of the job was the total abandonment of everything. The recruiter leaned forward, his gaze fixed on mine. He asked again, his voice low and even, "Are you in?" I thought about my wife, the way she laughed at the kitchen table, and the life we had carefully planned for our children. I saw the future we had envisioned, a path of predictability and warmth. And then I saw the alternative. I would become a shadow, a name erased from every ledger, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that would never know I had saved it. I would miss the milestones, the small triumphs, and the quiet moments that defined a life. There would be no recognition, no honor. The room felt suddenly small, the air thick with the weight of everything I was about to lose. I looked at the unmarked folder. The choice was a severance, a clean cut through the fabric of my own existence. I knew the cost, and I knew there was no turning back. I took a breath, the silence stretching until it was absolute. I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes." 3 days later, I arrived at a facility deep in the American South. Its location was deliberately obscured, a patch of land that did not exist on any map I had ever seen. I stepped out of the vehicle and felt the isolation immediately. I had spent years in the crucible of Delta Force and the relentless grind of SEAL Team 6, where the metrics of success were always physical. I knew how to push my body until my lungs burned and my legs buckled under the weight of exhaustion. I expected more of the same, a final, brutal test of endurance that would break me down to build me back up. I was wrong. The instructors did not care how fast I could sprint or how accurately I could fire a weapon. They stood in the center of the room, watching, waiting for something else. A realization dawned on me as the first day progressed. This was not about the strength of my arms or the speed of my reflexes. It was about the erasure of my impact on the world around me. They wanted to know if I could move through a room without leaving a ripple in the air. They wanted to know if I could disappear while standing in plain sight. The instructor handed me a grainy photograph of a man. His face was unremarkable, a blank slate that could belong to anyone in a crowd. My mission was straightforward: follow him through the city for 8 hours without being seen. I felt a surge of confidence. I had tracked insurgents through the unforgiving terrain of the Middle East and navigated the most hostile environments on the planet. This was just a city, and I was a professional. I stepped into the morning bustle, my eyes locked on the target as he moved through the streets. I kept my distance, mimicking the pace of the commuters around me. I felt invisible, a ghost in the machine. Then, the environment shifted. A woman with a stroller blocked my path, forcing me to hesitate for a fraction of a second. I recovered, but the target had already turned a corner. I pushed forward, my pulse quickening, and rounded the bend only to find him standing still, staring directly at me. He did not look surprised. He looked bored. I had been made. My elite training had failed me in less than 2 hours. The reality of my own visibility hit me like a physical blow. The instructor did not yell. He did not berate me. He simply laid out the photographs, a silent, cold indictment of my failure. I looked at the images, a blur of my own movement, a reflection in a window, a shadow that did not belong. "Start over," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. I went back into the city. I failed again on day 3, not because I was slow, but because I wore the same jacket twice. It was a subtle, critical error in the art of blending in. I had become a pattern, a recurring element in the environment that the target's subconscious could track. On day 5, I failed because I walked like a soldier. My posture was too rigid, my movements too purposeful. A predator's stride in a world of casual commuters. Every step I took announced my presence to anyone with a trained eye. Each failure felt like a weight, a slow erosion of the confidence I had carried. The instructor's voice became a constant, rhythmic echo in my mind. "Start over," he would say, and I would turn back to the streets. On the 7th day, the city felt different. I did not look for the target. I looked for the flow of the crowd. I moved when they moved, stopped when they stopped, and breathed in rhythm with the morning rush. My posture was loose, my gaze unfocused, a mirror of the thousands of commuters surrounding me. I spent 4 hours in a transit hub, shifting between platforms, blending into the chaotic tide of people. Twice, I felt the prickle of observation on the back of my neck, but I did not turn. I did not check my surroundings. I simply became part of the background noise. I followed the target through 3 different districts, keeping a distance that felt wrong. When the sun began to dip, I watched him enter his apartment building. I waited. The clock ticked past the 8-hour mark. I stayed at my post for another 10 minutes, ensuring no one was watching me, before I finally walked away. I had finally vanished. The instructor nodded once. It was the only sign of approval I would ever receive. He did not smile, nor did he offer a handshake. He simply gestured toward a chair, his eyes scanning me as if I were a piece of equipment being assessed for wear. The lesson shifted then, moving from the mechanics of surveillance to the philosophy of existence. He spoke of the heroes, the ones who commanded rooms, the ones who drew eyes, the ones who needed to be remembered. He called them liabilities. They were too sharp, too defined, too loud in their confidence. The unit did not want leaders. They did not want men who craved the spotlight or the validation of a successful strike. They wanted ghosts. He explained the concept of the gray man, someone whose presence was so unremarkable that the mind refused to store the memory of them. Average height, average voice, average rhythm. A person who could sit in a crowded room for an hour, contribute to a conversation, and leave without a single witness remembering they had been there. It was an art form of total mediocrity. I realized then that my past, my medals, and my reputation were not assets. They were obstacles to be dismantled. The final day arrived without fanfare. There was no graduation ceremony, no certificate to frame, and no handshake to mark the transition. The instructor simply tapped my shoulder as I stood in the hallway, his expression as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. He handed me a single, unmarked envelope and walked away, his footsteps fading into the silence of the facility. I opened it. Inside was a flight ticket to a city I had never visited, and a new passport with a name that felt like a stranger's. I looked at the name, then at the photo, and felt nothing. The man in the picture was not me, yet he was exactly who I had spent weeks becoming. I walked out of the building and toward the waiting car, leaving my old life behind in the dust. The unit had no fixed name. One day it was Gray Fox, the next it was Task Force Orange, then the Intelligence Support Activity. I boarded the plane, took my seat, and watched the ground shrink away. I was no longer a soldier. I was a ghost. The plane landed in a city of ancient stone and relentless heat. My first mission was waiting. I was no longer the man who had trained in the American South. I was now a German industrial consultant, a role that allowed me to move through the city without triggering a single alarm. I rented a small apartment in a district that saw little tourist traffic. It was functional, quiet, and entirely forgettable. My target was a financier who lived in a sprawling villa on the outskirts of the city. On paper, he was a pillar of the community, a man of charity and legitimate business. In reality, he was the architect of a financial network that fueled violence across the globe. My orders were clear. Get close. I did not approach him. I did not seek an introduction. Instead, I practiced the art of aggressive boredom. I joined a local gym, frequented the same neighborhood cafés at the exact same hour, and established a routine so predictable it became invisible. By the third week, I knew his schedule better than his own family. I tracked his movements from the villa to the city center, logging every meeting and every route. I became a shadow in his periphery. Never close enough to be noticed, always near enough to record. Then, the courier arrived. He flew in from overseas, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that held the keys to the financier's entire illicit empire. I watched him enter the hotel lobby, his movements hurried and nervous. I waited until he checked into his room, then moved. My team had already compromised the floor. We accessed the room while he was at dinner, the lock yielding to a master key in seconds. We spent 20 minutes scanning every document, every bank account, and every name in his ledger. We left the room exactly as we found it, the courier none the wiser. Within 7 days, the impact rippled across the globe. $40 million in terrorist funding was frozen in international banks. 12 key facilitators were arrested in simultaneous raids. 3 major attacks in Paris, London, and Bangkok were dismantled before the first detonator could be armed. The financier's network lay in ruins, and the world remained blissfully unaware of the ghost who had dismantled it from the inside. The financier was a victory, but the next assignment was a different beast entirely. They called him the Engineer. He was a ghost in the world of explosives, responsible for IEDs in Iraq, car bombs in Kabul, and a string of attacks across Europe. For 3 agonizing years, they had thrown everything at him. Satellites tracked heat signatures, drones hovered in the stratosphere, and a legion of analysts combed through terabytes of digital data. Nothing worked. He left no electronic footprint. He was invisible to the machines. That was why they called me. The mission was not a sprint. It was a slow, grueling erosion. I was given a 14-month window to dismantle his support structure. I had to find his doctor, his courier, his brother. I had to build a spider web of human connections that no satellite could ever see. It was a hunt that required me to shed my own life. I accepted the assignment, packed my gear, and vanished into the gray. The mountains were a jagged wall of slate and ice, shielding the village from the modern world. I arrived with a camera around my neck and a notebook filled with blank pages. My cover was a freelance journalist documenting rural life in the highlands. I spent my days in the communal tea house, sitting on low wooden stools, sipping bitter tea that tasted of wood smoke and earth. The villagers were wary, their eyes tracking my every movement, but I offered nothing to fear. I listened to their complaints about the harvest and their fears of the encroaching winter. I laughed at their jokes and nodded at their stories, a face they would forget the moment I left. Behind the mask of the curious traveler, my eyes were a constant scanning tool. I watched the men who came and went from the compound at the village edge. I mapped the patrol routes of the guards, noting the exact timing of their rotations. I photographed the heavy steel gate from a distant ridge, my lens capturing the faces of the couriers who arrived under the cover of night. Every piece of intelligence was encrypted and transmitted under the guise of mundane travel notes. The target remained completely unaware that the journalist was the architect of his end. The final coordinates were transmitted at midnight. I left the village before dawn, disappearing into the mountain passes, long before the first helicopter blades thrashed the air. 72 hours later, the compound was a smoldering ruin. The engineer was gone, his network dismantled in a single surgical strike that left no room for error. The news reported a freak accident, a gas leak in a remote mountain structure, but the intelligence agencies knew the truth. They knew the precision of the hit, the exactness of the intelligence that made it possible. But there was a price. 2 operators did not make it out. Their names were never released, their faces never shown on any screen, and their families were told they died in a training exercise gone wrong. Back at the facility, the wall remained. It was a cold, gray surface of concrete, devoid of names or dates. A technician carved 2 new stars into the stone. I watched from the shadows of the hallway. The mission was a success, but the cost was a weight that settled into the marrow of my bones. The years bled together into a singular gray blur of transit lounges and foreign hotel rooms. I became 19 different people, each with a unique history, a crafted accent, and a set of habits that were not my own. I lived in 14 countries, moving through the world like a shadow cast by a flickering light. I spoke 5 languages with native fluency, yet I found myself losing the cadence of my mother tongue. My subconscious became a crowded room, filled with the echoes of names I had used and the phantom lives I had inhabited. I would wake up in a cold sweat in a room in Prague or a villa in Cairo, needing a full minute to remember which identity I was currently wearing. The lines between the man I was and the masks I wore began to dissolve. Sometimes, I would stare into a mirror and see only a stranger, a face that belonged to the mission, not to me. The most terrifying moments were the quiet ones, when the work stopped and the silence rushed in. I would reach for a memory of my own life, only to find it obscured by the fabricated pasts of my targets. I was a ghost who had forgotten the shape of his own soul. The cost of becoming a ghost was not paid in blood, but in the slow, agonizing erosion of everything I once called home. My marriage did not end with a dramatic confrontation or a final, tearful goodbye. It simply withered, starved of presence and starved of truth. I was a phantom in my own house, a man who existed only in the margins of my wife's life. We became strangers, sharing a roof. Then came the children. I missed the first steps, the first words, the first scraped knees that required a father's steady hand. I was a voice on a crackling phone line, a face on a grainy screen, a man who was always leaving. My children grew up with a father who was a myth, a man who appeared for a week and then vanished for months into the ether. They stopped looking for me in the crowd at school plays. Their memories of me became fragmented, distant things, like old photographs. I had saved the world, or so they told me. But in the process, I had lost the only world that ever truly mattered. The silence of my life was a heavy, constant companion, but it was occasionally broken by the quiet hum of a world that did not know it had been saved. I would sit in a crowded terminal or a sterile hotel room, reading headlines that spoke of mundane tragedies, and I would look for the anomalies. A bomb that failed to detonate in a crowded subway station, a terrorist cell that vanished into thin air before a single shot was fired. 200 people, walking out of a shopping mall that had been marked for total destruction. These were my victories, written in the absence of catastrophe. They were invisible, silent, and entirely mine. I did not need a medal or a mention in a report to know the value of those moments. The knowledge that a family was still whole, that a child was still breathing, provided a cold, clinical satisfaction that anchored me. It was a strange, solitary currency, but it was enough to justify the years spent in the shadows. I was the ghost who stood between the light and the dark, ensuring the world kept spinning on its axis, even if it never knew my name. In those rare, quiet hours, the weight of my isolation felt less like a burden. Years later, I found myself in Rome. The city was a sprawling tapestry of ancient stone and golden light, a stark contrast to the quiet, hollow solitude of my own existence. I sat at a small cafe, the espresso bitter and hot against the morning chill. My hair was streaked with gray now, and my face carried the map of 1,000 sleepless nights. I was still a ghost, still blending into the architecture of the city, when a young man sat at the table nearby. He tried to look casual, but his posture was a rigid line of tension. He checked his watch every 30 seconds, his eyes darting toward the street with a frantic, unpracticed rhythm. I recognized the look immediately. I had worn that same mask of forced indifference once, long before the identities blurred, before the years of living in the shadows had sanded down my edges. He was an amateur, vibrating with the raw, dangerous energy of someone who still believed he was the protagonist of his own story. The young man shifted again, his leg tapping a frantic rhythm against the metal table leg. He was signaling his presence to every trained eye in the plaza. I could have leaned over, whispered a single correction, and saved him from the inevitable failure that was already closing in. I knew exactly how to fix his posture, how to soften his gaze, how to make him disappear into the background noise of the city. But I did not move. I did not even blink. To reach out was to break the fundamental law of our existence. We were ghosts, and ghosts do not acknowledge one another. If I spoke, I would be tethered to him. I watched him check his watch one last time, his pulse visible in the frantic throb of his temple. I looked away, focusing instead on the steam rising from my cup. It was a cold, necessary cruelty. I drained the last of the espresso, the bitterness lingering on my tongue like a final, sharp reminder of the life I had chosen. I placed the exact change on the table, a calculated, precise amount that left no room for questions or curiosity. The young operative was still there, his legs still tapping, his eyes still darting toward the street, oblivious to the fact that his failure was already written. I did not look back. I stood, smoothed my hands over the surface of the table to ensure nothing of mine remained, and turned toward the square. The Roman sun was high now, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to swallow the edges of the buildings. I stepped into the flow of the morning crowd, my pace matching the rhythm of the city, neither too fast to draw attention, nor too slow to invite scrutiny. I became a shadow among shadows, a man in a crowd of millions, a ghost in the machinery of the world. I moved past the fountains, past the tourists, until the memory of the cafe and the weight of my own history simply dissolved into the heat of the day. There was no trace of me left, no footprint, no echo, no name. I was gone, and the city continued, entirely unaware that I had ever been there at all.